Welcome to the Burning Archive. Today on the Burning Archive, I am talking one last time, at least for a couple of months, about the conflict in Ukraine, the conflict between Russia and NATO and the West, and what issues war and peace present for us all. This great conflict where we can see the tectonic plates of history clashing is raising deep questions for us all. And today I give centre stage to a listener question on the Burning Archive. That is the topic for today's Burning Archive. War and peace, yes indeed. We all are forced every day, I guess, as we see headlines and the detailed stories about events in Ukraine, and not just Ukraine, but Yemen and other places around the world, to think about war and peace. And it's made me think about Lev Tolstoy, the great Russian novelist of the late 19th century, his great novel War and Peace, which is about the events leading up to Napoleon's invasion of Russia in 1812 and Russia's ultimate defeat of Napoleon. And War and Peace is one of the great novels because war forces us to ask deep questions about decisive and tragic events and events that escape individual control, which I guess is why War and Peace ends with this long reflective essay almost by Tolstoy on a theory of history and whether even the actions of statesmen like Napoleon or General Kutuzov or Alexander II, the Emperor of Russia at the time of 1812, or indeed Volodymyr Zelensky and Vladimir Putin or Joe Biden, whether they are in control of the events on which they are bobbing about like apparent figureheads, or whether they're actually just driven on by necessity and the innumerous decisions of many smaller people. But war makes us think about what is a just war, what is a false peace, what is courage, what's forbearance of great suffering, what is patriotism, what are the flaws of patriotism, what is the right way for an individual to act in response to overwhelming historic events. And the story of War and Peace is also a story of a country, Russia, which was, before the 1812 invasion, in fact a friend and an ally of France, in which the elites of Russia were very friendly to France, very francophile. They spoke French indeed, but they were quite divided from their own people, where France represented the ideological successor of the French Revolution, freedom, equality and liberty, and yet it invaded and betrayed Russia. And ultimately, through Russia's stoic, heroic defense, the Russian elites turned towards their own people more than the aristocratic salons of Paris, and begin to forge a nation rather than an empire. The Napoleonic Wars are also very much one of the key events in establishing the Anglo-American supremacy in the world. All these themes are very, very resonant of our current times. And although by no means yet have we seen much reporting or literature or otherwise that has quite the moral seriousness of Lev Tolstoy's War and Peace or Vasily Grossman's Stalingrad and Life and Fate, which are the great Russian-Soviet novels of World War II, or the Great Patriotic War, as it's known in Russia. This week on the Burning Archive, I have in fact received a question from a listener, Cody, which does raise some of these deep questions that war poses to us all and helps us think through what is the right response to. So I'm going to read out Cody's question, which he sent to me on the phone, and then I'm going to respond to it because I think the questions he's raised are absolutely fabulous. Now, Cody is a listener to the show, so if you wish to send in a question to the Burning Archive, you can by all means do that by contacting me on my email, theburningarchive@gmail.com, or at Twitter, at archiveburning, or you can also leave me a voice question on the Anchor podcast platform, and you can click through that if you check out Spotify, if you listen to the app on Spotify. And also you can, while you're at it, leave us a review, like and subscribe, and do all those good things. And share the show with your friends on social media. Now, so Cody's a listener to the show. He's a young man from Melbourne, and I believe he might even be studying journalism. And this question, I think, shows that whatever Cody sets his mind to, he has got a fabulous ability to frame extraordinary, intelligent and serious questions about one of the great issues of our time. So well done, Cody. I think some of the journalistic establishments around town would do well to employ you. So Cody says here, thank you for your wonderful podcast series on the Russia-Ukraine conflict. I have found your analysis and perspective very informative and thought-provoking. I would like to hear your thoughts on something which has come to my mind repeatedly as I've listened. While I agree that the United States and its allies share some responsibility for the current conflict, I question your suggestion that Russia's invasion of Ukraine is a just retaliation to persistent Western antagonism. So, Cody's excellently questioning my suggestion that Russia's invasion of Ukraine is a just retaliation to persistent Western antagonism. What is a just war? Cody goes on, the United States and NATO have provoked a security dilemma through multiple rounds of NATO expansion and have persistently acted over many decades to alienate Russia and threaten its geopolitical goals. However, we have yet to hear you acknowledge the legitimate security concerns of countries like Poland or the Baltic states, which have been encouraged to seek NATO membership through the existential threat of Russian imperialism. So, what is the real answer? What's the solution? Russia can complain about security arrangements, but it too needs to come up with a solution that not only meets its needs, but Poland and the Baltic states and more broadly Europe. Cody goes on. As sovereign states, these countries are within their rights to determine their own security policy, and the fact that the Kremlin no longer has the influence it once did over these countries is no justification for the bombing and killing of civilians, the levelling of cities, and the destruction of countless lives. The Russian regime should not expect these countries to toe the Kremlin line if they do not wish, and the Kremlin has surrendered any right to expect its own security concerns to be respected once it violated the peace and stability of Ukraine. Innocent lives are being taken as an authoritarian regime lashes out because it can't have its way. And while you are, as in me, are absolutely right to highlight the arrogance and leadership failures of the Western political elite, we cannot accept that such violence is ever acceptable in this day and age. It was not in Vietnam, nor Iraq, nor Ukraine. With this in mind, do you acknowledge the destruction of Ukrainian cities and towns as a rational and reasonable act of self-defense from Russia? I think I'd read that to be, do you acknowledge the destruction of Ukrainian cities and towns is not a rational and reasonable act of self-defense from Russia? Thank you for taking the time to read my question. I hope it does not seem too critical of your perspective, as I really do agree with much of what you put forward. Excellent set of questions, Cody, and very respectfully and intelligently framed. Really, really fantastic. And as I say, I think they raise serious moral questions. And I also like the serious and generous spirit in which you framed the question. Can war be defended as a rational and reasonable act of self-defense by Russia or any other country, any other state indeed? Can any war be so defended? Can violence be accepted in this day and age, whether that is sending troops to a neighbour or weapons to another continent? Very important. And I mean, war is part of history. It is something we might easily think has disappeared from the world, or that only happens, on the TV screen or in remote parts of the world far, far from us. But it is, and perhaps these events of recent times has reminded us all that it is very close to home, very much part of history, inextricably part of history, and it has not been exiled from the civilized world. And I also think Cody's asked here 3 important historical or strategic questions, which I'm going to address as 3 main points. First of all, the security concerns of Poland, the Baltic states, and I guess more broadly implied, Europe. So what is the actual path to security and stability in Europe? It can't be war. It can't be the status quo. What is it then? What's the actual solution? So that's point 1, the security concerns of European states. The second is civilians and the levelling of cities. Is there a military alternative to total war, an alternative that minimises civilian impact? And the third question is about the authoritarian and imperial Russian regime. What exactly is the nature of the Russian regime, and is the increasingly global conflict that we are in, not just in a military conflict, but the economic and the diplomatic and the information war conflict, is it a conflict between democracies and authoritarian regimes? And I think when we look into each of these questions, and I think there's such great questions that Cody's asked, because I think looking into them helps us get beyond binary choice. We're either with the US, or we're with Russia, or we're with Ukraine, or we're with Putin. It helps us get beyond a binary choice, and I think getting beyond a binary choice can maybe help us generate some more realistic pathways to peace. So I'm going to make a few points about each of these great questions from Cody, these great sort of issues raised by Cody. First of all, the security concerns of Europe, Poland, and the Baltic states. So Cody says, we have yet to hear you acknowledge the legitimate security concerns of countries like Poland or the Baltic states. which have been encouraged to seek membership through the existential threat of Russian imperialism. So, yes, absolutely, I would acknowledge the legitimate security concerns of countries like Poland or the Baltic states, and indeed all of Europe, that is presented with this enormous resource-rich country, relatively large country, that is to the east of all the other countries of Europe, and yet also part of Europe. And some of those countries and Russia have had a very difficult history in the past. I can remember the crackdown on the Solidarity movement in Poland in 1980 or 1981. With the support of the Soviet regime. Hungary had tanks in 1956. Czechoslovakia had tanks in 1968. Poland and Russia have fought several wars in the 20th century, sort of immediately following the revolution in 1917, 1918, 1920 sort of thing, as well as, I guess, as part of World War II. For decades, those countries were suborned, I guess, through the Warsaw Pact, NATO's sort of counterpart, and had, yes, the interests of their country and the culture of their country suppressed by the Soviet Union and/or Russia. And indeed, even going further back than the 20th century, there's been conflict over the boundaries of Russia, Poland, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Empire for many, many centuries. In the 18th century, Poland was partitioned. So there is some deep and difficult history there. But fundamentally, I think it's also my belief is that there is no evidence of aggressive intentions from Russia towards Poland, the Baltic states, or the other states of Europe. The Ukraine issue is a very particular one. Now, there may be evidence of that, but I don't see it. I see Russia effectively having a defensive posture where it's wanting to strengthen its own rather vast territory and its own rather significant internal social, political and economic problems, and having defensive security at its borders, and that a line was crossed around Ukraine that led to the invasion. Now, some people might argue that Russia has interfered in the sort of domestic political affairs of the European Union, or it's trying to get the breakup of the European Union. But I just haven't really seen that sort of evidence. So absolutely, those countries have legitimate security concern. I don't see evidence of Russia going beyond Ukraine to threaten those countries. I think that is just conjuring an image of Soviet imperialism that is no longer the reality of what the Russian Federation is about. And on the other side, I see lots of more tangible evidence of threats to Russian security and threats to, want to try to break up the Russian Federation, to engineer regime change in Russia and all those sorts of things. Indeed, Emmanuel Macron has even criticised in recent days the Polish PM for some of these sort of aggressive stances. And, to some degree, I'd almost see some of the extreme anti-Russian sentiment as undermining security more so than any secret plan for Russia to rebuild the Soviet Union. Indeed, I think at some point Vladimir Putin once said something along the lines of anyone with a heart would not miss the Soviet Union, which is partly also referring to the culture and the esprit de corps, I guess, and some of the values of the Soviet Union. But, he said, no one with a head wants to bring the Soviet Union. No one with a brain wants to bring the Soviet Union back. So that, I just don't think, is really the objective. I think to some degree we have to take Russia at its word for saying it wishes to demilitarize Ukraine and get a security arrangement in Europe of indivisible security that respects the legitimate concerns of all the European states, including the neighbours of Russia, as well as Russia. I think also, though, what Cody's question brings out is that although Russia has proposed that there should be these security guarantees and there should be some kind of treaty that develops these like post-NATO, post-Cold War security architecture for Europe, I don't see any real tangible proposals for that. But ultimately, I think that is the problem that does need to be solved. There needs to be a real, specific, actual pathway to a European security architecture that has the primary players being Europe, all the states of Europe, including Russia, and that perhaps diminishes over-dominance of America in providing security in Europe. After all, Russia is Europe's natural economic partner, and it has been for centuries, in terms of population, markets, resources, culture, skills, education. It's a bridge to Eurasia, it's a bridge to China. So I just feel that the states of Europe, the elites of America need to stop dreaming of kind of breaking up and colonizing Russia and find a way to be its secure, fair partners in a pathway of peace, security and development. Is America really Europe's best ally? Is America really interested in finding a solution for security in Europe with less role for America? Is it going to take a war for America to withdraw? So I think, there's a fair call to say that there needs to be open acknowledgement of those security concerns, particularly of the ex-Warsaw Pact states. And I think there also needs to be more than just fine words and principles about indivisible security. There needs to be a real plan, a real set of institutions and treaties that can actually provide continental security in Europe. And since I was talking about the 1812 war and Tolstoy's War and Peace, let me just quote from the final paragraph of Dominique Lieven, the historian's book Russia Against Napoleon, The Battle for Europe 1807 to 1814, which is an absolutely brilliant account of the real story of the background to War and Peace. And he says, the basic point was that Alexander, i.e. the Tsar of Russia, was convinced that Russian and European security depended on each other. That is still true today. But perhaps there is some inspiration to be drawn from a story in which the Russian army advancing across Europe in 1813 to 14 was in most places seen as an army of liberation whose victories meant escape from Napoleon's exactions, an end to an era of constant war, and the restoration of European trade and prosperity. I think ultimately it's going to require the withdrawal of many of the American forces across Europe for for that new era of trade and prosperity to come back to Europe. And it might be quite a while. It will require the leaders of the European states and of Russia to sit down and negotiate a shared path to security and stability amongst themselves. You just can't cancel one part of or one partner in the peace agreement out from the equation, whatever the difficulties you've had with them in the past. So yes, that's question number one. What is the real path to security and stability in Europe that recognises the legitimate security concerns of Poland, the Baltic states, and all of Europe, and of Russia? And I suppose also of North America and China. I mean, the whole world has an interest, and of India. The whole world has an interest in finding a way out of this clash between NATO and Russia. It's genuinely destabilising the world economy and basic things like food security in the world. So we all have energy security. Even electricity prices in Australia are going to go up because of this conflict and its impact on coal prices. So we all have legitimate security concerns in finding a genuine, viable, practical, grounded, long-term, stable security architecture for Europe that involves all the states of Europe, including Russia. Okay, question number 2 was about civilians and the levelling of cities, and is there a sort of a military alternative to total war that minimises civilian impact? And Cody says the fact that the Kremlin no longer has the influence it once did over these countries is no justification for the bombing and killing of civilians, the levelling of cities, and the destruction of countless lives. This is the horror of war, isn't it? War is terrible. I was listening to a podcast with a former soldier, I think, who is now very much part of a kind of anti-war movement in America, a former American soldier, and he said the thing about war and civilian casualties is if you are, and I'm just quoting him here, he's saying if you are prepared to go to war, you need to be prepared to kill civilians, because that is what happens in war, and you can't kid yourself that war does not involve death, destruction and harm to civilians, that somehow it's insulated and restricted to professional soldiers. And I think there has been an aspect of the way in which Russia has, I guess, presented its military objectives that has, as probably all states do, because the challenge in that comment by that former soldier, recognising the moral difficulty of being a soldier, is that that's the terrible price that one has to pay, I guess, for conducting war, and the terrible moral price. And I think in the way in which Russia has presented its military objectives, it's very much about demilitarization and denazification, and I guess trying to minimise the sense in which it will have a negative impact on civilians. But the truth is it does, and that is the terrible consequences of war. I guess I'd say two things. One, in talking about that, we need to make sure we're reasonably accurate and prudent, I guess, in describing the nature of the civilian impact of the war in Ukraine. Are cities being levelled? There has been terrible damage in Mariupol, but I don't really think that compared to the bombing of Iraq, the bombing of Syria, the bombing of Serbia, that any of the damage that we've seen of any of the civilian damage we've seen in Ukraine is in the same category of intensity of damage. And of course, there is still damage, and it is still tragic, and it is still terrible. But this is not a total war against the civilians of Ukraine. It is a targeted war against the military and the political leadership, I guess, of Ukraine. And I guess there's also a need to be conscious of the high intensity information war that is being conducted. There have been so many false reports and exaggerated reports around what is or is not happening in Ukraine over the last month or two, and I think we need to be very careful in rushing to judgments, especially on the basis of one-sided reports around events, especially when there's an established track record now of distorted stories. Indeed, even the American information or intelligence agencies have said that they have consciously reported misinformation, knowing it is misinformation, but it's still effective. So absolutely, I abhor any civilian damage and death and the destruction. But I think we just need to be careful about comparative levels, given the nature of different wars, and the accuracy of the information that we get quickly beamed on our television screens or on the internet that can readily present a false account of what is really happening on the ground. And, there have been some quite extreme cases in recent times that I very much don't want to get into, but where some of those same issues are involved. And I think one of the reasons it's important to be precise, I guess, with our language here is it goes to the nature of the actual conduct of the war. Russia has not sought to sack Kiev. What Russia has actually done is surrounded key cities in Ukraine, provided humanitarian corridors out, not done that out of the goodness of their hearts, but done that to pin down key military forces in Ukraine so that they cannot join the main body of the Ukrainian army, which is in the Donbass, and that is now encircled and largely cut off from supplies, infrastructure, and will slowly be tragically destroyed. There's an element there of also not letting vivid images and vivid stories mislead us about what is actually happening, both in a humanitarian sense as well as in a military, strategic conduct of war sense as well. I guess the final point I'd make about this is that this question of impact, Russia impacting on civilians, it's true, but it's important to remember there has been effectively a civil war in Donetsk and Lugansk in the Donbass, and in parts of the Crimea, Odessa as well, really since 2014. There has been constant shelling going on, shelling from the Ukrainian government against the people, the civilians, who do not wish to be part of that Ukrainian government, but are its own citizens, in Donetsk and Lugansk for 8 years. So, and there have been, I think, nearly 15,000 largely civilians killed in that fighting. There have been peace agreements that have been formally signed up to, but then constantly breached by Ukraine, as well as by the separatist republics, not by Russia, although presumably Russia had some level of communication with those separatist republics. But there has been this civil war going on, and a great tragedy affecting those people for 8 years. So it's important to, when, dramatic events happen, that you think about where you start the story. This story doesn't just start on February 24th, 2022. This story starts at least in 2014. And there have been casualties of that war since 2014, including many children killed in Donetsk, in one of the major Russian cities. I think in the Arbat, in Moscow, there's the center of one of these main boulevards in Moscow is filled with panel boards with photos of the children of Donetsk who have been killed over the last 8 years in this war. Now, that's war propaganda too, but it's also a truth, I guess, about the nature of this war, that there is horror and terror and destruction and death occurring for civilians on all sides of this war. And it is all tragic, but I guess that is the nature of war, and that is why one needs to find a genuine pathway to peace, and not celebrate a sort of kind of a heroic demise of the Ukrainian regime, the bravery of arming civilian Ukrainians with rifles so that they can somehow fight tanks. That is putting your civilian population in harm's way. And, I find that as morally questionable as conducting a limited war against military targets that also affects some civilians. Difficult topic, very sensitive topic, so I hope you appreciate the sincerity with which absolutely I abhor it. But war has been part of human societies for thousands and thousands and thousands of years, and war harms civilians, not just soldiers. That is why we should do our utmost to prevent it. And I just don't feel that we in the West did our utmost to prevent both this war that started in 2022 and the war, the sort of proxy war with Russia that began in 2014. And I guess the only other thing I'd say there is economic war is a form of warfare too, seeking to destroy the economy of 170 million people. That will lead to starvation, disruption, bankruptcy, suicide, all the rest of it is bringing the dogs of war onto people, even if the method is playing silly games with rubles and the dollar, or applying sanctions rather than shooting missiles. It's not, just as I guess a contained bombing of military targets is not at the same level as a mass bombing of civilian targets, like the bombing that Russia is conducting in Ukraine is of a different order to the bombing that America conducted of Iraq and countless other countries. Doing that kind of economic war against a country is in a different of a people is in a different grade of harm, I guess. but it is still an enormous... It has deep consequences, and cancelling a culture like Russia, whipping up negative sentiment against Russians of all types, banning Russians from sports events, all the rest of it, is doing harm to innocent people. I think also enlisting the civilian populations of the West in a war against Russia that we are not rationally choosing. And so I have moral qualms about that as well. Okay, the third topic, great topic question that Cody raised is about the authoritarian and imperial regime of Russia. Is World War III really going to be between democracy and autocracy or authoritarian powers? And Cody writes that refers to the Kremlin no longer having the influence it once did over the Warsaw Pact countries, and that innocent lives are being taken as an authoritarian regime lashes out because it can't have its way. He also refers to the existential threat of Russian imperialism, and that the Russian regime expects countries like Poland and the Baltic states to toe the Kremlin line. Reasonable points, good questions. And this really raises some pretty profound issues too. I think among the more troubling thoughts of John Mearsheimer, who I think I've quoted as saying that the primary responsibility for this war rests on the United States of America and its active pursuit of the eastward expansion of NATO over Russian objections and against the advice of its own foreign policy and Russian experts and political leaders and military generals and all the rest of it. John Mearsheimer has also written about the impact of liberalism, in small L liberalism, as in the sense of liberal democracies, on the international order. And among his more troubling thoughts is that liberal democracies tend to bring war more than peace in the international affairs. That the great hope, I guess, post-1989 was that in a world of democracies, we would also be in a world of constant peace. But what we have found instead is that liberal democracies, particularly America, tend to pursue a fairly aggressive policy of exporting their values, exporting their regime to other countries, and in the process instigating conflicts, sometimes as moral crusades, rather than bringing peace and security amongst all states. By aggressively pursuing a policy of trying to make Russia a different kind of state to what it is, a state more in the image of the United States, then perhaps America has brought on a war. And certainly that's a different way of framing things to a lot of the discussion we're having, that, you know, this is a fight between democracy and an authoritarian regime personified in the evil, deluded character of Vladimir Putin. Bond villain and Russian thug all mixed into one. Fair enough. I'm not sure I'd want to live in Russia as a political, or as a polity, as a political entity. But I'm also not sure that a simple dichotomy between authoritarian and democracy is the best way of understanding what's really going on, or even understanding the intentions of the Russian state. Nor am I at all convinced that Ukraine is the best example of a democracy, that a fight for the glory of Ukraine, Slava Ukrainia, and I always wince whenever I hear that phrase, because I don't like nationalistic talk of the glory of any country, but talk of Ukraine as the weak democracy which America is going to save from a imperious colonial power like Russia, I think is seriously mistaken. Ukraine is a very corrupt and not very democratic place. It jails opposition leaders. It shuts down free, Russian language media and opposition media. It has universal male conscription at the moment, and all the men who fled Ukraine who are of fighting age, which is like 18 to 60, have been told that they will have to explain why they left the country rather than fight if they ever do come back. And it is deeply, deeply, deeply corrupt. But I'm not going to sort of bang on too much about Ukraine here. I think to me the perhaps more significant issue is, what do we actually understand is the nature of the Russian regime or state or government that we're dealing with, and who ultimately at some point we're going to have to sit down and negotiate stable peace and security arrangements with. We can't do that if we are befuddled by decades or even centuries of Russophobic rhetoric, of this great monstrous autocratic representation of the Mongol horde and the Asiatic steppe. There is some really quite questionable rhetoric that lies behind some of the assumptions about how Russia conducts itself, and what the Russian people are like and what the Russian leaders are like. And I think it's really critically important to understand that after 1991, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, even to some degree before 1991, when Gorbachev was still in power under Perestroika and Glasnost, there were the emergence of some forms of what we can call democratic institutions in Russia. So it's simply not correct to refer to, I think, Russia as authoritarian or autocratic. I think one needs slightly more finessed terms than that. It's certainly let's call it a conservative democracy. It's strongly informed by Russian Orthodox Church, and it's also strongly informed by its people's historical experience of the 20th century. They had a socialist revolution in 1917 that led to a civil war and a mass modernisation that led to famine and death and brutalisation and terror of millions of people. They lost 25 to 40 million people in the Nazi war of annihilation against Russia in World War II. They picked themselves up and rebuilt themselves and overcame Stalinism, and then ultimately saw their system collapse in a sort of sclerotic sort of economic failure, with a kind of a cultural smothering of some of the spirit of Russian culture. But then in the 1990s saw a kind of free market capitalist, bootlegger capitalist revolution that utterly impoverished the country and was a genuine geopolitical tragedy, was a genuine humanitarian tragedy. Like, I think I was the stat that male life expectancy fell 15 years in the 1990s. Even Vladimir Putin had to drive taxis in the 1990s to make ends meet. It was horrible, and so many political people in the West actually encouraged the collapse and the piracy of the assets of the Russian people during the 1990s, because they saw that as the final triumph of America over the socialist demons, and they were happy to strip as many assets as they could out of Russia. It was an absolute horrible tragedy, and I remember visiting Moscow and St. Petersburg and Irkutsk in about 2003 or so, and you could still sense the suffering of people, both from the Soviet era, but just as much from the travesty of what happened to Russia in the 1990s. It was partly some of the weakness of the elites in Russia, but it was also partly the approach of the West to Russia. And the reason I mention all of this is because I think perhaps one of the most important things to understand about Vladimir Putin or the current Russian government is that they've gone through 20 odd years of self-strengthening and gradual conservative rebuilding of public institutions. Russia today is not the kleptocratic Wild West of Russia in the 1990s, despite what you might read in the American press, and it is a different kind of regime. And I think there's a broader issue there too, because I think the Russian and the Chinese governments produced a paper towards the end of last year where they said, well, there's more than one form of democracy in the world. There's not one Coca-Cola flavour of democracy, and China espouses to be a kind of a socialist democracy. Russia, you could potentially call a conservative democracy, and the West, I guess, is the liberal democracies. But even in the West, how strong are our democracies? I mean, I've written before about John Donne, the English political thinker, who says, well, democracy is perhaps not the best word to try to explain how we try to solve problems collectively anymore. And, if you look around the state of democracy in America or in Australia, I think we all need to be a little bit careful about being in glass houses and throwing stones. Ultimately, we need international institutions that can accommodate multiple political orders, not just one. We don't need liberal rules-based order. We need an international order rooted in international law and the United Nations that can accommodate liberal democracies, conservative democracies, military democracies, non-democracies, because there's a few of them around as well, all sorts of states, because we don't really get to choose who our neighbours and who our neighbours are. I guess the other thing I'd just say about that is I do think it's a fallacy to say that Russia is eternally imperialist. It's constantly trying to recreate the glory of the Russian imperial past or the Soviet Union. And as I mentioned earlier in the podcast, Vladimir Putin's comment that no one with a heart would not long for the Soviet Union, and no one with a brain would want to recreate it. But that's a longer discussion. A discussion that is, if you're interested, there's a great book by Mark B. Smith called The Russia Anxiety, which is a fantastic tour of Russian history and the various myths that are presented in both the media and academia these days about Russia. And I think I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in some later podcasts. I should sort of wrap this up. It's been an incredibly rich conversation, I think. So thank you so much, Cody, for your absolutely fabulous listener question. Just maybe summarising, I think it's so important that we ask ourselves morally serious and important questions about this conflict in Ukraine and indeed any war and conflict. These dramatic events we are going to be remembering for the rest of our lives and trying to make sense of for the rest of our lives. So let's approach it with real seriousness and real attunement to the significance of them. Let's see them as the events that will be creating our own 21st century version of Tolstoy's War and Peace, or our own 21st century version of Vasily Grossman's Stalingrad. Thinking about war requires deep seriousness, not cartoon images of good and evil. And nor does it, is helped much by sort of social media, Twitter rages or lynch mobs. We should realise that events like this unfold in multiple timelines. Yes, there were some things that happened on February 24, but yes, there were also events that happened in 2014 that caused this, and 2018, and 2008, and 1991. And they relate to multiple decisions among flawed leaders and no less flawed ordinary people. We should realise that we've all been conscripted to some degree, slowly, gradually over years, into a war for the future of the multipolar world. And I don't know if anyone has really bothered to mount a serious argument to the people of the world. Why are we pursuing the future of the multipolar world in a war rather than a pathway of peace? I see in current events, in my darker moments, the world marching towards a terrible, terrible, terrible tragedy. Leaders making mistakes, ordinary people making mistakes, even people like me who are trying to read events as they're emerging making mistakes. There's no way that everything I'm going to perceive about this event will be right, but I do feel that one should try to at least make a good judgment about it, and a judgment informed by history. And leaders are making mistakes also, driven partly by interests, partly by their ideas, partly by bad ideas, and partly by just the forces of history, the forces of history that Tolstoy spoke about in War and Peace. And no less so are ordinary people making mistakes driven by passions and terrible moral choices. And it troubles me that people want to shut down discussion about this great war and peace of our times, whereas in fact true moral courage is to speak honestly about what one sees with real integrity. Vasily Grossman, who in a way wrote the 20th century version of War and Peace in the two novels Stalingrad and Life and Fate, about the Russian experience of World War II, the Great Battle of Stalingrad, where I think 1 million people died and a city was really levelled. Grossman wrote that the greatest tragedy of our age is we don't listen to our consciences. We don't say what we think. We feel one thing and do another. There are people whose souls have just withered, people who are willing to go along with anything evil, anything so as not to be suspected of disagreeing with whoever is in power. That's why I say the things I do on this podcast, and I hope all the good listeners of the Burning Archive accept it in that spirit in which it's intended, which is a serious discussion about the meaning of the tragic, mostly tragic, sometimes comic events unfolding before us. I've got to say the current climate of discussion of these issues is quite difficult. So I think this might be my last podcast on Ukraine geopolitics issues, at least for a little while. But what I think I am going to do on the podcast after I've finished my series responding to Isaac Rich's questions, with next one coming up about guilds and professions, I think I'm going to do a bit of a series on some key aspects of Russian history and some key gifts of Russian culture. because I very much do not wish to cancel Russia. I think we should all keep talking about Russia and understanding Russia, because Russia is going to be part of the multipolar world that will emerge from this conflict. And Russia is as much part of the culture that has been inherited, that has been passed down to me, and has been a huge part of my life as anything. So I'm going to do a bit of a series on a few key, not like the most famous, but some of the key individual figures from Russian culture, and perhaps some of the key moments, events and identities out of Russian history, and maybe do about 12 or so of those episodes, which in itself will be a way of exploring the future of our multipolar world, but perhaps without getting on, full-on clash of opinions in a environment of censoriousness about Russia and its current government's strategic intentions. Okay, so that is the end of the podcast for today. A huge thank you again to Cody, and a big shout out to such intelligent, thoughtful, insightful, and generously phrased set of questions. It sets a model for how we should all respectfully engage in dialogue with people, respecting their differing points of view and the good-heartedness that lies behind the struggle we all have trying to make sense of events of today. So thank you so much, Cody. And until next week, this is Jeff Rich from the Burning Archive podcast, where the past is not dead, the past is not even past, and where we always try to remember that what thou lovest well will not be reft from thee, including Holy Mother Russia. Okay, bye now.